I'm Susan Page, and this is States of America with USA Today. In this week's news, as COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. surpassed 275,000, the U.S. Congress may have breathed some life into another stimulus package. The Georgia Senate runoffs take place in less than a month, and new voters can register until December 7th. We talked to voter registration organizer Manny Rin of the New Voters Project. Misinformation and disinformation once again played an outsized role in our elections. How is that happening? And are certain communities more vulnerable? And President-elect Joe Biden has set out to have a diverse group of cabinet officials. How's he doing? Let's get started. We've seen months of fruitless negotiations on Capitol Hill for another COVID-19 relief bill, a new stimulus bill to help Americans who are struggling with the effects of this pandemic and the economic consequences that have followed. Here to talk about it is Nicholas Wu, congressional correspondent for USA Today. Nick, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Susan. We've been mired in this impasse on negotiations for the past several months. The last time Congress passed a comprehensive stimulus plan was in March, and so many of these programs are now expiring. But yesterday, a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced a $908 billion proposal that they saw as a temporary bridge over to a bigger package once the Biden administration is sworn in. And just before this call, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said that they would embrace this framework, which was a huge shift for them because they'd held fast previously at a roughly $2 trillion price tag for any kind of stimulus plan.
Yes, there's been some criticism of Nancy Pelosi for being unwilling to take half a loaf in the months before the election. She wanted $2 trillion. The administration was willing to go up just over $1 trillion. Somehow they could never reach a deal. How much time do they have left to reach an agreement?
Not much time at all. There's only about 2 weeks left in this session of Congress before they leave, before a new Congress is sworn in. And, Democrats are saying that they might be able to get a compromise done, but, this being Capitol Hill, anything is possible.
Just broadly, what do you think a bill is likely to include if they are, in fact, able to reach one?
So there are certain provisions where both sides agree. So, for example, reauthorizing what's known as the Paycheck Protection Program, which provided loan forgiveness for small businesses. This was a very popular program. Both sides liked it, and that's likely to be in there, as is some kind of enhanced unemployment benefit, although the exact dollar amount per week is something that both sides are still haggling out. And lastly, vaccine distribution funds are something that both sides say that they agree on and will be especially prominent as we get closer and closer to one. I think for the sake of everyone that's suffering from the pandemic, I would certainly hope that members of Congress could put aside their differences on this. But seeing all of the fits and starts in negotiations over the past several months, I'm frankly a little bit pessimistic that this will get done, especially in such a short time frame.
Yeah. Inaction is usually always the safe bet when it comes to looking at Congress. Nicholas Wu, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Susan.
When we come back, we'll take a look at 2 runoff elections for the U.S. Senate that will have a big impact on the White House agenda.
I'm excited to vote because I get to participate in changing the future through something as simple as casting a singular vote, because every vote matters.
A lot of states were important in this year's election, but now we've all got Georgia on our minds. It's not only that Georgia swung from being for Donald Trump in 2016 to Joe Biden this time. It's also these 2 Senate runoff elections in January that will determine control of the U.S. Senate for the next 2 years. Voter turnout among younger voters was a big factor in this election, and there'll be even more younger voters eligible to vote in the Georgia runoffs in January because some of them will have just turned 18 and be eligible to vote.
Hi, my name is Danielle and I'm from Marietta, Georgia, and I'm going to be voting for the first time in January.
Here to talk to us about those voters is Manny Rin. He's head of the New Voters Project, which focuses on mobilizing the youth vote. It's a group that's been working hard in Georgia and elsewhere. Manny, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
Tell us what kind of role you think younger voters are going to play in these Georgia Senate elections on January 5th.
I think young people, especially as we saw results from the general election, will play a pretty big role. in Georgia for the runoffs. If you look at the historic youth voter turnout rates from the general election, especially in Georgia, we saw the youth vote share increase from 15% to 21% in Georgia alone, which is the highest increase from 2016 to 2020 in any state across the country. So if you consider that, especially all the enthusiasm and excitement to make sure young people's voices are heard, I think that they will play a pretty big role in the next couple months.
I'm excited to vote because I get to participate in changing the future through something as simple as casting a singular vote, because every vote matters.
You know, that jump of 6 percentage points as a percentage of the electorate in Georgia, that is a huge number. What made that possible? What turned out younger voters in Georgia this year?
I think a big part was a lot of the community organizing done by a number of organizations, including ourselves. I think we played up a pretty big role, at least at Georgia State, where we ran most of our program, really focused on peer-to-peer interactions. And of course, that looks a lot different in the pandemic, affecting the election and school and really our country as a whole. But focusing on peer-to-peer, whether it's through text messages and phone calls, even using social media, made a pretty big impact. So being able to focus on those sort of tactics, we reached over 100,000 students over the course of the fall, and then directly reaching 8,000 students in the last 10 days before the election.
How is mobilizing young voters different from mobilizing older voters? Are there special challenges?
Yeah, in many ways, there are different unique challenges. Like anything else, when you do something for the first time, you may not get it down 100% and completely. So with new voters, one of the biggest reasons why people don't turn out to vote is because some of these obstacles of just doing it for the first time. So whether that's registering or making a plan to vote.
I am educating myself as a voter by watching and reading credible websites and constantly trying to stay informed on both parties.
With the pandemic this past fall, there were a lot of new ways for Georgia students to vote, whether it's early or by mail. So being able to talk to a fellow student and another peer, often voting for the first time as well, went a long way in making sure they actually cast their ballot in time.
What are the issues that matter most this year to younger voters?
I think there are a lot of issues that young people care about, specifically for that age group, and whether it was around protecting the environment or healthcare, jobs and the economy, racial justice and equality. All of those really played up in many different ways over the course of the last fall, but also the last couple of years. So I think for me, it was in my experience working in Atlanta and Georgia, all of those to some degree came up. And it's clear, based on how we turned out, young people are willing to vote to create a future that works for them.
We know from the exit polls nationally, the polls of voters after they cast their ballots this year, that younger voters were much more Democratic than older voters. And I wonder, is that something that Democrats can count on sticking through the lives of these younger voters as they become older voters themselves? Is that something, how you vote when you're 18 or 20, does that stick with you when you're 50 or 60?
It is important to me, not only as a young adult, but also as a woman. I want to vote for someone who takes basic human rights into consideration and reinforces equality for all genders, people of color, and the LGBTQ community.
As a nonpartisan, nonprofit student organization, we're mostly concerned about students just casting their ballot and voting for whoever shares their views when it comes to the issues that they care most about. But we do know that the earlier someone votes, whether it's 18, 19, just the first opportunity they have, the more likely they are to participate in future elections and also civics in general. So that's why we focus a lot on engaging these new voters.
So Manny, you worked in the November election in Georgia, now helping to mobilize young voters in the special elections, the special Senate elections in Georgia. Is it different? Is this runoff election different in some way from the general election?
In some ways, it has proven a little bit different. One, there are unique challenges with it being over the course of November and December, and of course early in January. For young people and students specifically, it is during the holidays, it's during finals week, it's during the holiday break and winter break. So it's even more important we make sure students know all of these important deadlines, when they need to register to vote, when early voting starts, making sure they have a plan to vote before January 5th.
One last look back at election 2020 when we return. Did misinformation once again shape who made their way into government offices?
It just seeks to tear things down and to throw away expertise.
Disinformation, misinformation, and questionable claims, they have cropped up in every corner of this year's presidential election. Marginalized communities nationwide, including Latinos and other immigrants, have been particular targets. Joining me now to discuss the issue is Ashley Nurbavig. She's covering the story for the Detroit Free Press, which is part of the USA Today network. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start by defining some terms. What's the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, so the way I like to think of it is one kind of has more intent. So, misinformation is the broad umbrella term for anything that's incorrect or false information that you might see. So that can range from a meme that's not meant to be misleading and is just meant to make a joke, to something that's more in the line of disinformation, which is when information is weaponized to create a sense of suspicion and to promote a false narrative that can be helpful to someone, especially when we're talking about in a political campaign.
And you write that these closed messaging apps have been a particular vehicle for spreading misinformation and disinformation. Tell us just very briefly, what's a closed messaging app?
Yeah. Honestly, a really good example, if anyone's used Snapchat, it's an app where when you go on, it's more, there are more blocks to helping you get to seeing everything that's going on the app. So if you join Facebook, you're going to have a bunch of groups thrown at you. You're going to have a bunch of pages. You can search your friends' names. That all becomes a lot more difficult on a closed messaging app. A lot of the time, especially for things like WhatsApp, you need to have a link to get to some of these groups, or you need to know your friend's name or their phone number in order to add them.
So that makes it harder to monitor, for example, for a fact checker to take a look at what's being spread on some of these apps.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you are sharing in a group that has hundreds of thousands of people in it, but we don't know that it exists, the way that you can go on Facebook and say, a big one are Michiganders against Whitmer, or any of those types of, terms that you can search really easily, stop the steal. If it's not something that you're just looking off of keywords, it becomes a lot harder to know that a group exists, and then even farther to then know what's being said in that group.
Give us an example of some disinformation that was spread during this election.
Yeah. One really popular one was that dead voters were voting in the election, which is really interesting because that comes up every year, but it got taken kind of a step further because now all of these people who are online are put together a list of people who were over the age of 100 in Michigan and who had voted in the election, and then started to try to prove that those people were actually dead. Another one was that obviously the big one was that the voting machines were actually switching the votes. And again, this is something that we'd seen in the 2000s when Diebold voting machines was the big, scary name, but for the Democrats, they, and that got shut down pretty quickly by mainstream Democrats saying, we're not going to necessarily dive into this conspiracy theory that Diebold is changing votes, but that has really taken off this year with Dominion voting systems.
So why should we worry about this? What kind of impact can it have?
That is such a great question because, in 2016, there was a lot of debate about that. How much impact did the Russian misinformation and disinformation campaigns have on the election cycle? And it was harder then to kind of trace it. But what we saw in Michigan was that it really mobilized people to show up at the Detroit's TCF Center, which is where Detroit was counting its absentee ballots. And what was happening was that all these smaller Facebook groups were saying, there are 35,000 suspicious votes that just got dropped off. We need you down here now to come help us count it. And so all of these people mobilized to go there. And in response, a bunch of progressive Democratic groups started doing the exact same thing. And so it was really fascinating to see how much the things that were being shared online were coming into real life. And then another example, when we start talking about communities, foreign language communities, is that a lot of the ethnic media in Detroit, Arab American News, Latino Detroit, these papers started to have people who, especially Latino Detroit, people would come up to them when they were doing outreach in the census community and say, we're scared to vote. And, we're not just scared to fill out the census, we're scared to vote. We're scared that there will be a record of what we did and who we voted for, and that will somehow be used against us. And so there was just a lot of places where you started to see it really spill into everyday life.
So people don't know who to believe. Sometimes it prompts people maybe even not to vote. So just quickly, what ought to happen? What ought to happen to try to address the issue, particularly of this disinformation, of deliberately telling lies to try to affect our elections?
I talked to a lot of experts about this, and we talked about a lot of different things. There are people who are working to create bots whose kind of job it is to, we think of bots as this really negative thing, and there are people who are kind of trying to work bots into our system to create more equality in the speech and in the stories that get shared. And so the best advice I can give people is just that, disinformation, as attractive as it is and as good as it feels to feel like you're going up against this broad conspiracy, it employs this idea of critiquing these great institutions without giving us a solution. It just seeks to tear things down and to throw away expertise. And rather, if you're ready to critique, and if you are critical of something, and you offer solutions and you offer a path forward, that is so much more constructive, and you'll find it missing in disinformation campaigns. And so if you find yourself going down this path of, being really critical, check yourself and make sure that it's being critical in a way that is can move us forward, not just leave us all kind of fighting.
Ashley, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Some of those same marginalized groups are asking President-elect Biden for representation in his cabinet. We'll bring Nick Wu back to discuss.
You're never going to make everyone happy on the first cut of all of these cabinet positions.
The transfer of power in the White House from outgoing President Donald Trump to incoming President Joe Biden in some ways got off to a slow start, but now it's full steam ahead. Several cabinet appointments, including the head of the State Department and the Treasury Department, have already been announced, and some of them are groundbreakers. Janet Yellen would be the first woman ever to serve as Treasury Secretary. But some groups are wondering where their place is on Biden's team. Joining me now is USA Today congressional reporter Nicholas Wu. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Susan.
So it's the season of jockeying for big jobs in the new Biden administration. And we've heard some complaints from people like Jim Clyburn, the South Carolina congressman who played a key role for Joe Biden during the Democratic primaries. What is Clyburn saying?
Clyburn is saying that Biden needs to put more Black people in his administration to help, I guess, honor in a way these crucial constituency that helped elect Biden. So Clyburn, for example, wants people like, I believe, Congresswoman Marcia Fudge of Ohio to be the agriculture secretary.
Yes, she would be groundbreaking in her way, a Black woman to head the agriculture department. We've also seen a pretty coordinated campaign by groups of Native Americans to get a Native American in the cabinet, the first Native American to serve in a president's cabinet. Tell us about that campaign.
Exactly. So another appointment that could make history is if Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico, who is Native, were appointed as the Interior Secretary, which is a sprawling federal agency that oversees policy on federal lands and oceans, and also relations with Native American tribes.
And talk about Asian Americans. Asian American voters came out in a big way in November. Is there some effort on that part as well when you think about the big appointments that President-elect Biden is going to make?
There is. In talking with Asian American lawmakers, what I've seen them point out is that increased Asian American turnout across the country, and particularly in crucial swing states, help boost Biden to victory. So one name that the Congressional Asian Caucus, for example, has settled on is Vivek Murthy, who is Obama's Surgeon General, and they want him to be somewhere in Biden's cabinet, perhaps as someone in charge of COVID response or as the Health and Human Services Secretary.
As you know, Nick, we talk about the big four when it comes to the cabinet: State Department, Treasury, Defense, and Justice, the most important jobs in a new president's administration. Joe Biden has appointed leaders for two of them: Anthony Blinken at State, Janet Yellen at Treasury. What about the other two? What's the pressure on him to, for instance, put an African American in one of those big jobs? Can he make everybody happy?
Well, you're right. It's very likely that he'll put a Black person at one of these top positions, but you're never going to make everyone happy on the first cut of all of these cabinet positions. And as we saw with Biden's appointment of Neera Tanden as his OMB director, there was already some backlash from progressive Democrats who saw her as too close to Hillary Clinton, and Republicans who criticized her past tweets. But as for these big positions, we'll see more of these announcements either leak out or come out in the next few weeks, and we'll see exactly who Biden ends up naming there.
Thanks for watching. I'm Susan Page, and this has been States of America, honest conversations on the issues that matter most.